Good evening. My name is Madeline De Delfa, and I am the Assistant Director of Programs and Community Engagement at the Rose Art Museum. On behalf of the Rose Art Museum and the Creativity, the Arts, and Social Transformation Program at Brandeis University, I'm delighted to welcome you to Artist on Artist, Helena Metaferia and Sheda Soleimani. Tonight, we are very pleased to welcome two of the artists featured in the exhibition, Face-to-Face Portraits of Self and Others, on view at the Rose through December 29th. Face-to-Face Portrait of Self and Others is co-curated by Dr. Ganeet Ankori, Henry and Lois Foster Director and Chief Curator, and Chad Sirwaf, Associate Director of Marketing and Communications, Rose Art Museum. We are delighted to have Ganeet here tonight to help moderate the program with me. Ganeet?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Maddie, and welcome Sheda and Helena. It is a privilege and a pleasure to say a few words about the exhibition and to introduce my two most esteemed colleagues and friends, the artists Helena Metaferia and Sheda Soleimani. So maybe we can just review the slides of the exhibition. Face-to-Face Portraits of Self and Other highlights a stunning array of photographic portraits drawn almost exclusively from the Rose Art Museum's permanent collection. The exhibition features photographs produced over a century by a multi-generational and diverse group of artists from across the globe. So really, in terms of chronology and in terms of geographic reach, very, very diverse and truly a treasure trove from our permanent collection. Now, observing the riveting photographs that Chad, my co-curator, and I assembled in the gallery, the versatility and virtually limitless possibility embedded within the genre of portraiture becomes apparent. Additionally, the show deliberately highlights remarkable examples of the medium's experimental and evolving nature. So we have all the techniques of photography since its invention, practically. Often the topic and the technique are not separate, but the artist's approach melds with or is aligned with the specific techniques, and they become part of the iconography, part of the meaning, or meanings, plural, as is often the case with great art that has many, many layers of meaning. So today, Maddie and I are thrilled to host two artists whose works really shine within the exhibition. Both artists utilize photography in very innovative and distinct, original ways. Both artists capture portraits of political activists in their work, and they also are activists themselves as well as artists. Now we will introduce both artists briefly, hear from one, then the other, and then engage in a conversation. So it is an honor to introduce our two guests. And Maddie, would you start with Helena, please?
Certainly. Helena Metaferia is an interdisciplinary artist working across collage, assemblage, video, performance, and social engagement. Her Ethiopian American identity and political activism find potent expression in her work. She received her MFA from Tufts University's School of the Museum of Fine Arts, so she spent a lot of time in the Boston area, and attended the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. Metaferia's solo exhibitions include Museum of the African Diaspora, San Francisco, California, 2024 and 2017, Center for Book Arts, New York, 2024, RISD Art Museum, Providence, Rhode Island, 2022 through 23, and Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, Massachusetts, 2021 through 22. Her work is in several museum collections, including LACMA, Boston MFA, and our very own Rose Art Museum. Helena is an assistant professor at Brown University, and she lives and works in New York City. Ganeet, would you introduce Sheda?
My honor. So Sheda Soleimani is an Iranian-American artist, educator, and activist. She's also an incredible colleague here at Brandeis University, where she serves as Associate Professor of Studio Arts. So Soleimani is the daughter of political activists who were persecuted, jailed, and forced to flee Iran in the 1980s. They became exiles in the United States, where Shada was born. The two portraits on view at the Rose Art Museum explore her parents' personal histories, as we shall see shortly. Soleimani makes work that melds sculpture, collage, and photography, highlighting her critical perspective on Iran's historical and contemporary sociopolitical occurrences, but she also casts a critical eye at other regimes, and capitalism and criticality is one of her tools, I would say. She received her MFA from Cranbrook Academy of Art and her BFA from the University of Cincinnati. Her recent solo exhibitions include Ghostwriter at Adele Asante, and she's shown in London very, very often. She's also shown an exhibition titled Negotiators at Kunsthaus Photo Forum in Switzerland, in the Providence College Galleries in Providence, Rhode Island. Many, many more. Those of you who are going to Miami, she's going to have some work there with, I think, Adele Asante as well. What can I say? She lives and works in Rhode Island, and I just have to say that it's such a pleasure to host you here, and your affiliation with the Rose and showing your work at the Rose is so important to me and to us, to the entire team. So now, as we turn to look at Helena's Headdress 38, which you see here on the right, but which Maddie will show us in full form. I want to just say that I saw this work in a riveting solo exhibition at Praise Shadows Gallery in Brookline. And I was thrilled to meet Helena there, although we had met before, but to see her surrounded by her phenomenal work. There was a video, there were other things, and the amazing gallerist Ying and her staff were all around, and I just felt smitten by the art, and then was thrilled that we brought this incredible portrait into our permanent collection. So I wonder if you can say a few words about this work and everything else.
Thank you, Ganit and Madeline, for this incredible introduction. And I'm so honored to have this work in the permanent collection at the Rose Art Museum. And thank you to Praise Shadows Art Gallery for facilitating that connection. And to Shada Soleimani, I'm really excited to have a public conversation with you, although we are friends and we talk often. So it's nice to have this as a discourse about our work. And this work here, Headdress 38, which is in the exhibition, is part of a series called Byway Revolution, which I have started in 2018. So it's been about 6 years now of doing this work. And I work project-based as an interdisciplinary artist. I work across mediums, including video, performance art, social engagement, two-dimensional objects, including collage, as well as three-dimensional objects, including assemblage and sculpture and installation. And so for this project, I have worked through and beyond mediums, maybe even transdisciplinaries. I'm trying to push what those mediums are and what they can do. And this is a photo-based collage with the sitter being Martina Tan. Martina was a participant in a workshop that I facilitated, a socially engaged workshop, which was only available for those who identified as Black, Indigenous, people of color residing in the Boston area when I had my solo show, in advance of my solo show at the MFA Boston in 2021 to 2022 called Generations. And so Martina was a student of, I believe, Tufts University at the time. And like the other participants, had some sort of affiliation with the Fenway Corridor. And the project had multiple parts to it. There was I think this was COVID time, so we were actually meeting over Zoom, very much like how we're meeting now. Although a lot of my my social practice projects are in person, and they are performance as protest themed. So there's a lot of embodied movement. So we had to like translate that over a virtual setting, which I think worked out quite well. And from those who participated in the workshop, people returned to become photographed about a week later, to be a part of the archiving of this sort of modern day activism that we kind of gather to create in and through and beyond institutional space. And I say that because I'm very conscious and aware of that sort of dichotomy. There was about 6 months of research that followed, where I had some in-depth conversations with Martina about how Martina identified, and I researched along with research assistants, including Marla McLeod, who was a research assistant of mine, who was a former Tufts University student. We researched histories that Martina, who identified as Chinese American, who, based on that history of activism that allowed her to feel like she could take up space within that particular environment. We also looked at Asian American queer activism, which Martina also had some sort of identifications with. And that to me was a starting place. I also looked at a lot of headdress motifs, because that's a part of my practice, is to think about what adornment looks like across cultures, and as a way of thinking about positioning and elevating one's place in society through the regalia that a headdress can bring. And so these archives they are, as we saw before, they are coming through the eyes, so there are interventions on the eyes, which feel like this gateway to the being, but then they're also adorned on top of them. And the show was called Generations, and it's about generations of activism. And then this came out of that MFA Boston show, and then I showed an iteration of Praise Shadows concurrently. So that's this particular work. And if we go to the next image, then we can see how the work lives beyond this particular work and into, let's see, we lost the screen. There we go.
Sorry about that.
No, I'll just keep talking. So the next image is from my current solo show at the Museum of African Diaspora in San Francisco. And again, I do these workshops in advance. So I've done about maybe 7 or 8 around the country and internationally, and worked and do a deep dive of research in local archives. So the one from, the Boston project was mostly archives within Harvard University's Radcliffe, as well as Northeastern University Special Collections. And then here in the Bay Area, I did a workshop at Yerba Buena Center for the Arts in February. And then this was a sort of coalition between 4 institutions that supported this work. So in addition, Stanford University, Bolinas Museum, and Museum of African Diaspora were also participants in this project. So there was a lot of meetings across institutions to see about how the intervention can be not just site-specific to one institution, but it can rethink about the role of the institution in the public, which is obviously to be of service. And so the work I felt should be about interior and exterior space. So this is a public-facing mural that exists on the outside of the museum. And it can also be about interior space. So there's on all floors of the museum, there's different parts of the exhibition being held. It's also about reaching into and thinking about ways in which the public archive can be made more visible. So there's always a bibliography for each one of these collages that I engage with. So this is Grace Anderson, who's a sitter, who is a queer identifying climate change activist living in the Bay Area. I'm also in the process of making a film called By Way Revolution based on this series. And Grace Anderson is actually one of the participants of the film as well. And that film will be released in 2025. So this is what it looks like on a larger than life scale. This is about, I would say, 2 stories or 3 stories high. And then we can go to the next slide. In addition to the 2-dimensional work, I've been thinking about ways archives can live more physically with this 3-dimensional work. And so this is a crown motif that is now surfaced as a brass sculpture with etching. And it's made to be worn in performances. So I do these live performances called The Willing, and this was actually activated 3 weeks before the national election in a live performance that occurred within the museum, and then it was a processional about 1 block radius across about 4 or 5 major cultural institutions in the Bay Area. And so the archives are all from, mostly in this particular piece, 1960s civil rights activism. And of course, thinking about the election and the possibility of someone, a woman identifying person from the Bay Area with the potential to be the next sitting quote unquote queen was something that we were hoping to give energy to. And then the next slide. And so for me, the work is about assembling and gathering the archive. And sometimes that's the archives that I help create and facilitate. So this is a interdisciplinary, participatory installation called The Work. And it's been with iterations around the country. So it's really important for me that the work travels and has dialogue in rural parts of the country, in major cities, West Coast, East Coast, North, South. I'm really interested in having these really difficult conversations about what change means and what it means. It usually is very subjective. And so to participate in this installation, there's a QR code or usually like an index card you can fill out that you can submit the answer to the question, what is your everyday revolution? How can you contribute to social or political change on a micro or macro level? And these are some of the selected responses. Iterations of the work have resulted in protest signs, in buttons, in banners, in a meeting table with engraved text on it that's laser cut in. As a risograph book, there's been many ways in which I've broken up that text into almost poetry to kind of think through how people are responding to this idea of how they hold the tensions of change, but also the possibilities and the hope. And what they envision for a collective future. And that kind of sort of engagement is really what my work is about. It starts with process always, whether that's social engagement, performance, archival research, and then it manifests as an object, but the object to me doesn't mean much without the process being readily apparent. And so, yeah, so these are all at the Museum of African Diaspora in San Francisco currently.
Before we move on, I just want us to take another look at this with everything that you've said in mind. The way that Martina Tan is here, the way that she's wearing this beautiful headdress. She's crowned with her activism that you've researched. I love the decorative motifs, the playfulness. And this is what you're doing now, where it grew and became three-dimensional and is constantly continuous and nomadic in a way. It travels, as you say. So thanks for that riveting introduction to your work. I'm sure we'll have a lot of conversations about it. And now to Shada and the 2 works that are now at the Rose, Dissident and Agitator. Part of the Ghostwriter series, which you collaborated with your parents, but also did quite a lot of research. That's also something that brings you together. It's activism and research and very bold and wonderful art.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for including this exhibition, and I'm so glad to be in conversation with all of you, and of course, Helena, who is a dear friend. So this is great to just be able to chat about a lot of the concurrent themes in our work. I know that we share a lot of similar thoughts and ways of making and researching. So yeah, stoked to talk about it. So I'll just dig right into it. So my background coming into making images comes from that of someone that does not trust the medium of photography. I believe that photography is an extremely non-consensual medium in which historically, you know, the camera has been used to document the other, and the other has been documented by, you know, really cis white men that have been feeding the canon of photo history and photojournalism. And so in thinking about that, and in my teaching, as many of my students know, I'm really interested in thinking about what does it mean to create a consensual photographic practice? What does it mean to subvert or challenge the language that photography has always employed, to shoot or to take or to capture, all colonial and, terms that are also extremely violent. And so in thinking about that, I'm not interested in, taking photos, but I'm interested in collaborating to create stages and sets and tableaus in which, the objects that I photograph as well as the people that I photograph are showed at equal levels of respect. In that, I think about consensual photographic practices and what does it mean to photograph something. In Ghostwriter specifically, I'm working in collaboration with my parents, who are both political refugees from Iran. My father and my mother both were part of a leftist Marxist group that was against both the Shah as well as the Ayatollah's totalitarian regime. So pre-1979, against the Shah, and then after the fall of the Shah and the rise of the Ayatollah, against the Ayatollah as well. So my father escaped over the mountains on horseback. He was in hiding for many years. He'd been arrested. And after a 2-week journey over the mountains, he made it to Turkey, sought refuge, eventually was able to come to the United States. My mother's journey was a lot more difficult. When she attempted escape, she was unfortunately imprisoned, and she was in solitary confinement for over a year. And so to this day, she has severe PTSD because of that event. And a lot of, my upbringing and growing up was listening to her, talk about these things. And my parents, the generation that they're from also doesn't really believe in therapy. So I became a child therapist in the sense. But for me in this work, it's really important as considering becoming, the holder of these stories, being someone that's collecting oral histories. And in Ghostwriter, I'm ghostwriting their stories in photographs. So in these two images, you see my mama and my baba paying homage to their roles as political dissidents, as agitators, as people that, were pro-democracy, pro-Kurdish freedom, pro-women's rights, pro-queer rights, and they were getting trampled really by the Ayatollah's regime. And many people often think that the Shah was much better, but really freedom of speech was not great under the Shah as well. And so in the images, when I talk about creating a backdrop that's consensual, I'm thinking a lot about the form of collage being a political tool in which bodies are cut, coller is to cut in French, and so collage comes from that. I'm thinking about how we are, by collaging objects or collaging images together, we're creating cyborgs. I think a lot about Dada, art and Hannah Hawk, and thinking about these fragmented bodies and what does it mean for bodies to be amalgamated of bits of many different things, images, clothes, news stories. And so in this image, you're looking at a backdrop that is built. You have various different kinds of patterns and images. The predominant image that you see here is the image of Namazi Hospital, which is no longer called Namazi Hospital. It is the hospital that my parents met at and worked in, and they would hold all of their leftist meetings in the emergency room. And so during the revolution, a lot of, Islamic law was cracking down and saying that people in hospitals, working in hospitals, were not allowed to treat activists that were part of left-leaning movements. So if there was, some sort of demonstration and activists were harmed or hurt, the doctors in the hospitals were told to not treat them, which is against ethical, medical rule. And so my father and mother would obviously defy those rules and set up guerrilla hospitals on the outskirts of Iran, and held a lot of their meetings in the emergency rooms of the main hospital. So that image of Namazi Hospital was actually taken before the revolution. It's the postcard that my mom got when she started working or going to school there before the revolution. And she points out every time that there is a sculpture of a nude woman in the middle of the fountain. And after the revolution happened, that sculpture of the nude woman was knocked down. You'll also see these kind of screen printed symbols on top of the image of the hospital. So that's the logo of the party that my parents were a part of. And so I'm looking at a lot of the publications, I'm researching a lot of the writing they did, a lot of the writing that their friends did, and kind of incorporating those in with the images. You have checkerboard patterns. I'm thinking a lot about games and game theory. The game Snakes and Ladders is an ancient Persian game, thinking about the games that immigrants have to play to be able to escape, games of luck and chance. And so you'll see a little bit of the snake print in the background as well. And then, of course, the rugs are rugs that my father escaped the country with over the mountains on horseback. And I think the most important thing here is in collaborating with my parents, they have said that they do not want their faces to be directly shown and for their identities to be protected. And so in both, of these images, you're not seeing them masked, but you're seeing them facing away from the camera. In other images in Ghostwriter, their faces are covered and masked completely. So as a form of protection, but also thinking about the same way that I talk about the history of photography being non-consensual, we are always, looking at images of people and assuming and stereotyping and building identities for them. So that's another kind of thing I'm thinking about there. And then, I guess next images. In this image, you're seeing this is called Panjere. Panjere means window in Farsi. And so my mom had, one window in her solitary confinement cell. And that window was really the only place where the light would come in through the room every day. This is a sketch that she has done for me of her solitary confinement cell. She did this sketch for me many times growing up. So we would go out to, a restaurant to eat or something. Like at Olive Gardens, they'd have a paper tablecloth. They'd give me crayons, and my mom would repeatedly make this sketch over and over again to describe her solitary confinement cell to me. And so you see, here, the direction of the light coming in through the window, the food tray that they would bring her every day. And the sketch, that she'd done for me so many times, we decided that we should make it large and we should kind of create a version of the solitary confinement cell for her to be within as someone who is now freed. The ladder as a, reference to Snakes and Ladders, the checkerboard doing the same as a form of escape, and then the crow, a bird that I've rehabilitated on top of the ladder. In this image, safekeeping. So one practice that my mother was not able to do when she forcibly had to come to the United States was to practice as a nurse. And it was really the true joy of her life, was to work as a nurse. Caretaking is really important for her. And when she was not able to practice nursing in the United States, she began taking in injured animals into our home. And so I grew up with my mom doing a lot of wildlife rehabilitation, which was a pretty non-conventional way of growing up, having lots of wild animals running around the house and watching her painstakingly try to save or help every single one. And, in this kind of like labor of care, I was raised to, learn the same things. I've done it my whole life. I did it in college out of the bathroom of my apartment. And now I run a full-scale wildlife clinic and hospital in my own home in Providence, Rhode Island, which is also a nonprofit. Every year we treat upwards of 2,000 injured birds that are injured due to human, infrastructure. So animals that run into windows, get caught by cats, are poisoned by rat poison. All of these patients come into our hospital on a daily basis. I get upwards of sometimes 50 calls per day. And so in Ghostwriter, I'm also thinking about that lineage of care and tracing that lineage of care from my mother who, taught me how to do this, to me, and to both of us doing this work together. So this is her feeding some American robins in a little tin that she actually taught me how to cook food in when I was a small child. Image. I think this is the last image. This is called The Blind Owl. In Farsi, we would call it Bufekur. So Bufekur is a very famous, like really a seminal text, Persian existentialist text by an author named Sadegh Hedayat, who is actually friends with Jean-Paul Sartre. In this book, you know, we're thinking a lot about psychological blindness, like physical blindness, like thinking about things that our minds are shadowing from us or the world. It's also like really this political kind of like commentary of the time. But in this, I wanted to bring in the blind owl in a little bit more of a literal sense. In my work as a wildlife rehabilitator, I treat so many owls, probably upwards of, gosh, I just have to do the numbers, but 300 or so at least a year. It was 312 last year, I believe. And this year, I think it'll be more. These owls are hit by cars while they're hunting. They are maimed, and oftentimes when they come to me, they're presenting as completely blind. And unfortunately, when they are completely blind, they are not releasable back into the wild. And so it's my job to euthanize these birds. Humanely, obviously, but it's really heartbreaking work. And so in this, I wanted to start thinking about other forms of captivity, you know, thinking about my mom's confinement as well. These are the bricks of the outside of the home that she was in hiding in, the archival images, thinking about the seeds that she escaped with from Iran. So really like one form of care for her was bringing a lot of the native fruit that she grew in her own garden and growing it in pots in our house now. So these are actually clementines or little oranges from her tree that she grew, and thinking of those as kind of this obfuscation of the eyes of the owl.
Wow. So I'm going to stop sharing now so we can see all of you, but maybe we'll go back to the PowerPoint just so we can talk about the images themselves. Thank you, Shada, for sharing all of that with us. I'm wondering if you would like to open it up, Helena and Shada, to ask each other questions before Maddie and I jump in.
I just had a point of connection. I know we've talked loosely about our work, non-officially, but yeah, I started By Way of Revolution in 2016. My mother passed away, and she was a women's rights activist. And so I grew up in a household, and my father teaches political science. And so as expats of Ethiopia, they were very involved, heavily involved in Ethiopian politics, to the point where my father couldn't return back to Ethiopia safely for almost 40 years. And my mother did a lot of work as an expat using her liberties as a US citizen. So I feel like it's really interesting that both of our work is informed by our upbringings.
Absolutely.
And being first generation American and internalizing stories that are stories to us because we had a different lived experience, that it shaped our work when we became makers. And my mother being a researcher, a teacher, and an activist, and then me using research and pedagogy in my practice as well, and community organizing, because she ran a nonprofit and she was an organizer. I feel like that is something that it's like a way of knowing. It's like a way to connect. And when she passed, I was reaching and connecting and grieving for a longing for maternal love. And for me, I was like, well, she was very committed to service, and she was very committed to women's issues. And I know I have the compassion that leads in that way as well. And so it was my way of connecting with her, but it's almost a generational service. And I think, Shada, you have obviously demonstrated that. And I guess my only question right now that I can think of to you is, do you find that the repeating of the stories of the trauma, the pain, the joy, the familial, the intimacy, it's so vulnerable? Because I know that for me, when I tell these stories, I'm like, that's a gaze into my life and my psyche, which informs my practice. And as artists, we get called to do that work all the time. Does it ever get tiring for you, or does it feel very like you're so removed from it because it's your practice, your work, and you speak on it so often? Does that ever come up for you?
Interesting question, and thanks for asking it. I was actually going to ask you something similar. You know, I don't think I'll ever be removed from it. I think it's impossible to be, right? I mean, like, I'm sure you probably wouldn't be able to say that you're fully removed from it either, as much as we have to talk about it casually or non-casually. I think it took a lot for me to feel comfortable with doing it. You know, I started making work about my parents for the first time when I was an undergraduate student. I was, 18, 19, 20. I didn't have supportive faculty. My faculty were telling me that, my faculty that were teaching me were telling me that these stories were too personal and no one could relate and no one understood what Iran was or the politicians that I was speaking of, and it was too vague. And so I was told over and over again to make my work, quote unquote, more global. I also went to school in Ohio, so it's a little different. And I remember being like, okay, I guess that, if these people that are artists, that are professionals are telling me to work this way, I'm going to shift my paradigm. And so that's when I started focusing really on thinking about global human rights issues. And, really, I didn't think about using my parents again until recently. In about 2016, 2017, I made a series called To Oblivion, in which I was thinking about the stories of women that have been executed by the Iranian government for crimes they didn't commit. And I remember doing an interview. I had my first solo show in London, and I remember having my first ever interview with a journalist and being young and being like really excited and being like, oh my God, someone's asking me questions. I can't believe it. I'm having a solo show. And then realizing that journalists actually are really dishonest. And a lot of the things that I thought that I was saying casually or in confidence, ended up becoming clickbait for an article about me and my work that had nothing to do with my practice whatsoever. And so it was really recently, it was during COVID. And I don't know, I was just thinking about disaster. I do. And I was like, what am I going to do if my parents are gone? Like, how am I going to tell their stories? And it really took me until this point in my career, until I was 30 years old, to feel like I had the ability to like talk about these things. And as the keeper or holder of these memories or these stories, to be able to share them in a way that's not exploitative, which I'm sure you probably think about all the time when you're working with other people. Like, how can you tell their stories or represent them in a way that is consensual or respectful? And also, there's only so much control that we have over our audience and how they're going to read the images that we're putting out there.
Right. Shada, do you want to ask Helena something else, or should we start?
I want to hear about your film, but maybe we start and we talk about your film along the way.
Yeah, well, we can talk about the film. There was also a film in Praise Shadows. It was a video of I saw it as giving your subjects agency because they spoke for themselves about who they are.
Yeah, it was actually filmed on Zoom for the workshop. So it was like a performance we did because again, it's a performative practice. So most recent workshop participants also participated in a live performance. So the performance I did at Museum of African Diaspora, some of the former participants came back. So there's like this like, even though they've done one workshop with me, it's not just a one-off thing. We have continued conversations for the year and a half that I do research. They come back for the show. They come back for performances. Some of them end up being my studio assistants, some of them end up being my mentees, and they make friends with each other. One got hired at a museum because of this work, and so I feel like there's this ongoing community building that should continue when I'm gone, right? Like I'm just that facilitator. And in terms of the film, I'll just throw out a little teaser. I'm working with an amazing all women of color production team, and like the director, behind the scenes, camera, sound, everyone's a woman of color, based in the Bay Area, called Break Tide. The film is called By Way Revolution. It features it's a short doc. It features the lives of 5 women of color activists, including, I am one of the cast members as well, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who does media justice and is the founder of the 1619 Project, Grace Anderson, who does climate justice, Chef Tiza, who does food justice, and we also have a Palestinian activist who does fashion wear and fashion justice. And so that film is kind of a day in the life, but it brings the research and it gives, again, agency. So it gives people a platform to actually tell their stories rather than me mediating those stories. Because although I love making objects and collage, it's my interpretation, and I'm often projecting headdresses and Ethiopian motifs and, my parents' narratives and all of these things, versus I wanted an opportunity for people, even though I'm in the editing room doing a lot of that too, but it just feels like it needs to be something where it can be unfiltered.
Mm. So Maddie and I had several questions that related to fragmentation. I was thinking if the fragmented quality of both of your works, and I know you make them differently. Helena's is actually a collage, whereas Shada makes these dioramas in her studio and then photographs them so that they're flat, but they're two-dimensional, but they maintain that fragmentary feel. And I was wondering if it had to do with the immigrant experience and with your kind of intersectional identities and those of your sitters as well. Maddie had a really, really interesting take on it. Maddie, is your sound okay now?
Hopefully. Yeah, I mean, it struck me, particularly with your work, Shada, that it's the fragmentation is almost, trying to reconstruct a narrative, and that the viewer is put in this position of trying to sort of figure out this narrative. And to me, it felt like recovering a traumatic memory, kind of the way things become very fragmented through trauma. So
Yeah, I mean, I love that read, and it's not far off. There's so many different ways for me of thinking about how fragments act. Like, again, thinking about like the cyborg being amalgamations of all of these different things, especially when it comes to memory and ghostwriting. Like memory is really strange in that way, where if my mother, for example, is recounting a story, it's never going to be exactly the same, both times or however many times in a row. Sometimes there's a detail missing. Sometimes there's a detail added that she's never mentioned before. And I'm like, oh my God, wait, where did this come from? Sometimes it takes on a totally different tone. But at the root of it, there's a place or a space in which this kind of memory occurred. And so in that, especially for Ghostwriter and thinking about the holding of these memories. I'm also thinking about these collages becoming like map keys and these rooms for becoming like a theater of memory in a sense. So thinking about building that into something a little bit like, I don't know, more easily able to be picked apart than something that's just like a decorative flattened thing. But I'm also really interested in obfuscating and confounding and thinking about how all of these layers and these fragments, they are actual physical fragments in the studio. But what happens when we do, actually photograph them? The photograph has the ability to flatten space. And I think the flattening of space could be an extremely violent thing. What does it mean when something is a memory, or a story or a political event, and then that's translated into becoming, three-dimensional, becoming alive, becoming animated in a sense. And then what happens when you reanimate something or when you deflate something and literally flatten it on itself? So, in thinking about fragmentation and collage, I'm thinking a lot about all those things.
Helena?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking a lot about collages, like feminist history and political histories. I have an interdisciplinary practice. Before collage, it was painting. After painting, it was performance and video and all of these other sort of, and I was searching for a medium where I could really, I guess, interrogate histories and potentially turn them into a mythology because I'm questioning the story. I'm questioning the narrative that we've inherited. And oftentimes my work is about placemaking. So in that, there's a bit of working through fragmentation in terms of identity. There's a forgotten history or an untold history, rather, of women in activism, women and gender marginalized people in activism that I'm eager to tell and retell and rethink because in the archive, it's not as pronounced of the labor that women and gender marginalized people do within activist histories. It's not a very pronounced documented trajectory and history. And so I'm working through that by making the most predominant face that's in all the faces within the work being the modern day sitter who is a self-proclaimed activist of whether it's an everyday person to a more frontline person. And so working through time, working through so that you can kind of connect the dots amongst the narratives that allow this person to be here, to be present with the liberties that we have today. And so I'm working through time as a fragmentation, both in terms of memory, or in terms of documentation, the unknowing of something to relearn what has potentially happened and occurred, but hasn't been historicized. So I'm interested in that kind of experience. And to me, in my search of mediums, collage did that the most immediate. It allowed me to work with what's real, meaning documentation and archives, which we hold sometimes precious because they're institutionalized as fact when they really are as subjective. The way they are acquired is sometimes very problematic, actually, and things get misqualified, miscategorized, unnamed, unsourced, all the time. And so yeah, so working with that and using art as a medium to sort of make sense, so that we can sort of orient ourselves. So there's a bit of mapping, so to speak, mapping our trajectories of histories and our current moment.
I would just now, as you were speaking, I was thinking that there are fragments in both your works, but there's also a reconstruction that's very, very powerful. And actually, that's what the work is. The piecing together of these pieces that have been misplaced or misunderstood, or as you said, just completely overlooked, and then you bring them together. And Helena, the way that you form crowns, the way that you give them adornment, the way that these pieces of activism that have been overlooked become something that's not just there and celebrated, but also beautiful, is that way. And for you, Shada, also, as Maddie pointed out, they're like these pieces of memory, pieces of traumatic experiences that there's a healing, there's a mending when you put it together. Yet you obfuscate people's faces. You don't, you protect it as if you're protecting them. Can you speak to that? Because, Martina Tang's eyes are covered, and you deliberately, Shada, agreed with your parents that they will look away. It's like their fist is the only thing that identifies that gesture of being a dissident and an agitator. But can you talk about the covering of the faces?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in my work, I've actually never shown someone's face, whether it be in Ghostwriter or Medium of Exchange. When I was doing To Oblivion, the faces were fabric printed faces of deceased women found from internet archives. And so I think it's really important for me to acknowledge the history of photography in phrenology, physiognomy, the study of images to identify individuals' archetypes based off of how far apart their eyes are spaced, or how dark their skin might be, or how do we read gender. And so I think a lot about societal conditioning, stereotype and prejudice, and how that really is so deeply intertwined. I think about Alan Sekula's, The Body in the Archive, for example, is like a really important reading for students to think about when they're thinking about how we have circulated images of bodies and identified them throughout the history of photography, criminal images, for example. And so in thinking about all of those things, it's for me a really important decision to actually not show faces directly in photographs as a means of protection or as a means of obfuscation. At the end of the day, someone is going to look at that photo of my mother and notice that her skin tone is darker. And they're going to be like, oh, I read that person as a woman. I read her as elderly. But at the end of the day, they're just looking at, a body without a face. And I think for me, that removing of the face, when it could become, for some people that are thinking about portraiture, the face is really important, and thinking about identity and thinking about showcasing identity and celebrating identity. And for me, it's a method of protection from the harm and the gaze that, photography has created through its existence.
Lena?
Yeah, I mean, I cover the eyes. That's my intervention. I'll give you a lot, but I won't give the eyes away. And what you get instead is these drawn on eyes that I cover with, and I add additional people onto it. Yeah, I really am very adamantly interested in showing, in this series particularly, showing the body's whole. Meaning, like, although, like, whether it's bust size or full figure, they are intact. And even though I collage around the image, I want to leave the body intact, because for me, it feels violent to see Black bodies deconstructed, or brown bodies deconstructed, or whatever, female bodies deconstructed in a way where there is some sort of characterization displayed upon it. So that's just something that I stick to within my own practice. And I know that it is a giving of the body, but for me, it's the preservation is what I'm really interested in, because I'm thinking of creating an alternative archive, an alternative world where the labor and the legacies and the invisible labor, oftentimes, of women and gender marginalized people are written into history. And so for me, like, the wholeness feels important, but I definitely allow some protective measures, and I'm interested in notions of, like, what it feels to find respect through image. And for me, that could be even in the care that I use in showing the archives of activism. I will say, deep in the archives of activism is a lot of violence, and there's no getting around that. Protest isn't always beautiful. It's not always singing. It's not always, chanting Kumbaya, right? There is a lot of retaliation for what people feel is troublemaking, right? And you want to make trouble. You want to trouble the laws that are already incredibly troubling. And so that is something that I've had to work through, is how do I show, if I want to show violence in image. And oftentimes this is where my personality comes in. Like, I do some editing, but I don't edit everything, right? Or I don't want to just show the cliche thing of what we've seen, like the water hosed woman, or the, the person who is bit by dogs. Like, when those images start to come up, I find the ways in which things get covered and things get revealed, things get covered and things get revealed, not just because of the trauma that's inherent in those happenings. It's out of also the respect to the people who may very well be alive, who are unnamed, who are in those archives today. Sometimes the best bibliography comes from when somebody recognized somebody in the photographs that are in the archives and can tell me more about what this person is, who this person is today, can name the person. This person's now a lawyer. This person's now living in this city. This person, and the library could give me nothing.
Right.
So just, if I didn't say it before, all of my images are hand scanned from library archives around the country. Nothing is digitized. Most of the time, 10% of their collections are digitized. So I'm helping the library digitize oftentimes by asking for these scans, or scanning them myself or with assistance. So it's very different than the circulated images that are on the internet, which already have been, I mean, we're in a modern world where we consume so many images all the time, but these are the surfacing of what's kind of deeper in those repositories.
I'm cognizant of the time. We have 5 minutes left, and there are 2 questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to read both of them, and we're going to try to respond, and then Maddie will take us away. So the first question, Charles Thomas, thank you for asking. What role does texture or apparent texture and shadows play in either expressing or calling attention in your work? The other one is regarding dissident and agitator. What is the Persian text below the screen print of the logo? And would you mind sharing the name of the party your parents were part of? Is any part of the tableau digitally altered? The answer to that is no. These pieces are so mesmerizing. It is such a privilege to hear more about them. Thank you so much for being here. And will this be recorded to hear from the beginning? Yes, this is recorded. It will be on our YouTube, The Roses YouTube channel. And now, Helena, you can start with the texture. Shada, you can start. You have 2 minutes each.
Can't wait.
Well, I think texture in my own work, I mean, I make very different types of work. So sometimes I'm working with silkscreen archives on tapestries, and of course textures play more of a role there. But yeah, all of the collages that I make, specifically one of the Rose Museum, are hand cut and assembled. So I don't really work with Photoshop. I mean, I know how to use it, but it doesn't interest me to manipulate in that particular way. I'm interested in the handwork. So the tactility of the work feels really important to me. So the hand painted elements, the drawn elements are all in the work. And for me, it doesn't come together until I'm moving things around and intuitively finding compositions that are most interesting. So yes, texture comes about because there's multiple layers of paper operating in a singular space. And so naturally some will lift, some will recede, and no matter what kind of adhesive I'm using, there's going to be the different plays of different types of material.
Totally. I love that about your work. Like when you actually see it in person, like noticing all of those kind of like layers and the kind of breathing space between them, I really love. There's just also like intimacy between like how the pieces touch one another, and they like kind of build this connective tissue and relationship that I like love seeing in your works when I see them IRL.
Thank you.
Texture for me, I think it's more about shadows and materiality. So I'm like really obsessed with queer cinema. I think a lot about Jack Smith, who was an incredible filmmaker in the 70s, unfortunately passed away during the AIDS crisis. But in Jack Smith's films and a lot of like kind of DIY queer cinema, we're seeing a lot of just like standard everyday objects used, like people working together to take like sheets off of a bed and string it up, and like what type of texture or shadow or line does that create? You know, using scraps of like fabrics, and like really thinking about like also the feminist history of quilting and what does it mean to be quilting these backdrops in a sense and building them. And then lighting is really important. So you'll notice in a lot of the images of Ghostwriter, there's really intense drastic shadows. I'm thinking about theater, again, theater of the mind, but I'm using really specific types of light shaping tools to really think about the play between like what's real and what's not. If you look at old photographs where there's shadows in them, like old like daguerreotypes, and you see a shadow or reflection of the body, that used to be like a reference to how something is actually real or alive, that it has mass or it has a shadow. It's like some weird ghosty kind of thing, but I think about that a lot. And then dissident and agitator. So the Persian text below the screen print of the logo. So that logo is, if you look at it up close, it's a bunch of tree trunks that look like they're armed, they're holding arms. It's a reference to one of the first armed struggles that happened in the jungle. It was part of the Fedai people of guerrillas logo. And so under it, it just says the name of the uprising and the armed struggle. The party that my parents were a part of was a break branch off of the Fedai guerrillas. They were in Rah-e Kargar, which means the workers' way. It was a Marxist laborers party that, you know, was like a laborers union kind of situation. And no, they're not digitally altered. It's really important for me to build everything in the studio. The photoshopping that I do is basically minimal to none. I might like, you know, brighten an image a little bit, but that's really about it.
Wow.
Thank
Thank
you
you
so
both.
much.
Really riveting. Thank you for making time. Maddie?
Thank you. Thank you. This was really an inspiring and an important conversation. And I'm so grateful to you. And I'm so grateful to everyone who joined us tonight. Thank you. And I encourage you all to see face-to-face portraits of self and others in person. It's on view at the Rose through December 29th. And we also hope you'll join us for another program around this exhibition, a virtual conversation with Catherine Opie on Thursday, December 5th. So mark your calendars. And thank you both, Jada and Helena.
Thank
so much.
you.
Guys.
And thank you for allowing us to be with your artwork. You know, even though they have some deep and difficult themes within them, they're also beautiful, which is that, you know, people come and are attracted to them, and then they start peeling the layers and looking at the strata of meaning. And there's so much dignity in these portraits. So thank you.
Thank you so much. It was like
Thank you,
such a
Sammy.
pleasure to speak with all of you and to be in conversation with you, Helena. So good to see you and hopefully soon in real
Good
life.
to see you too. I'm always a fan of your work, Shada. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.